So, as Maya and her panel so depressingly left us last evening, even if we do everything that we think we should, we're still going to have a big problem closing this gap about how we pay for everything. And so the title of this conversation is, Can You Spare Some Change? How to Pay for What We Want and What We Need. And so what I'm going to ask, so that we have a chance to engage, is we've got 4 folks with some really interesting creative ideas about the categories and how to think about how we can help fund the necessary changes in the government for the next while here. And so I'm going to ask everybody to give us 3 minutes on ideas that should be on the agenda. Then we'll open it up here quickly for a little conversation among the panel and go to the audience. So with that, Maya.
Okay, thank you. Let me start by saying that I think after this calendar year, we are going to enter a world that is an all-pay-go world. So there are a lot more things that are going to happen this year where we're going to borrow money and not pay for things, mainly related to the economic recovery and extending various expiring programs. But more troubling from my perspective is the big discussion that's about to happen, whether to extend the expiring Bush tax cuts without paying for them. And I think that clearly to me seems like absolutely the wrong time to make that choice to do that without paying for it, but I think we're going to. I think that's going to make the deficit and debt situation far more worse than it already is, and I think sort of starting in 2011, you have to come to terms with that. It is an all-pay-go world. If you want to do something, you have to also think of how you're going to pay for it. And we're going to bump up with all sorts of arguments why that shouldn't be the case for investments, productive investments that would have high returns over time, or for tax cuts, which have returns to the economy over time. And unfortunately, I think those arguments, which can be right in either case, are casualties of having waited so long to deal with the fiscal problem. So given that it's all pay-go, how are we going to pay for things? I'm just going to quickly go through 5 tax ideas that I think are the most likely to gain a lot of traction in the coming years. The first is tax expenditure reform. The tax base has become where we do most of our social and economic policy through deductions, credits, exclusions, exemptions. All told, in a $3.5 trillion budget, we have $1 trillion in lost revenues every year because of tax breaks. This is a great place to start tax reform. It would be better for the tax code. The policies don't get nearly enough scrutiny or oversight. They tend to be regressive. You can make a lot of changes there. The second tax, and hopefully we'll hear more about this, but is one I certainly favor, is looking at energy as a source of taxation, deals with energy policy, environmental policy, and revenue policy. A third is thinking about consumption taxes. The VAT has gotten off to a wobbly start. I've always been a fan of something called a progressive consumption tax, less simple than a VAT, but more progressive. And I think we'll hear more about that. One of the advantages of consumption taxes, obviously, there's a incentive to save more than we currently have in our tax code, but it's also a way to tax old capital, which strikes some as unfair, but actually I think is probably one of the things we should be thinking about. The fourth, and it may be too late for this, but I just think not extending the expiring tax cuts, and not just the ones for over 250. I think we don't extend all of them until we figure out how to make this better. Perhaps you extend them for a year if you really think that would do damage to the economy. I don't, but we'll find out in the matter of weeks or months whether that's still on the table. And finally, I think the transaction tax is going to get a lot more attention. It's something the G20 is looking at. It's something the IMF is looking at. The narrative that has stood in the way of a very small tax on every financial transaction for a long time has always been that it would slow down markets and potentially hurt liquidity. Suddenly that narrative, which was a negative, sounds to a lot of people like actually quite a good thing. So I think that will have a lot of popularity. Just really quickly, I don't think you talk about this without talking about spending. Revenues are only half the budget. If I were sequencing how to think about reducing spending, I would go through, I alluded to this a little bit last night, but first, the smallest part of the budget, but just going through outdated programs, finding the programs that can be made jokes, get rid of them so that you build up credibility. Next, a really exciting thing is starting with defense. I think defense is so clearly on the table, and I think it's going to be the next 2 years, a lot of focus on rethinking our security policy and bringing down costs in defense. And then, and only then, I think you move on to where the big money is, which is social insurance. My preference has always been to think about repurposing social insurance so it's more of an insurance program and less of a middle-class entitlement program. That'll be the hottest topic of all of those. And just finally, where I think the most exciting area is of government reform, and we heard about this in the education panel and the healthcare panel, is how do you look at what the government does look at our priorities, which we don't really do any kind of a strategic plan for government, and think about our priorities, and instead of thinking about how to spend more on things and having to find offsets, how to take the pot of money and we have in each area and make it spent better. So I think making government efficient may well be sort of the next decade's focus for policy entrepreneurs.
Great. Thank you. Lisa.
I guess I'll just start by saying, the oil spill, since we haven't really talked about the oil spill. Oil spills have this sort of political chemistry, and we don't know yet what the end result of this one is going to be, because the oil hasn't really started washing up on the beaches. But once those oil birds start coming in, things are going to start happening really quickly. So I'm going to kind of tell you what I'd like to see happen. The first thing is we're going to readjust those payments. First of all, Tom Friedman would like us to put a $1 tax on gasoline, and that's a great idea, and it works in classical economics. The thing is that that's going to hit the people who make $50,000 a year really hard, the people with a family of 4, because they can't change their car, they can't change their commute. They're basically locked into a pattern of energy use that actually costs them a lot of money. When you look at people with $50,000 a year income, they spend more on their car and energy and repairs and finance for that car than they do on taxes or on health care. This means it's essentially sort of a systemic tax on these people for getting back and forth to work, and they can't make any changes in it. They're locked into it, and the rest of us are locked into their consumption patterns. So I don't actually agree with that. I think that what we actually need to do is reform the fact that we all pay a lot of taxes for energy on April 15th. So the first thing we need to do, and which should be perfectly easy, is to change the Minerals Management Services way of extracting money from oil companies for producing oil. We actually rank 93rd out of 104 countries in the percentage of profits on oil that we get, or the percentage of take on that oil revenue. That's actually, unfortunately, not a tremendous amount of money, because we don't actually have that much oil. So maybe we're talking an extra 5, 10, 20 billion at the most for that.
I love when we say 5 or 10 or $20 billion is chump change. But
well,
okay.
I mean, compared to the stimulus, it's pretty small. So the next thing to do would be to combine. We need to figure out a way of getting people out of that energy trap who are in the sort of middle class or lower middle class, and stimulate the growth of new, very competitive energy-saving products. And at the same time, we need to deliver a consistent signal that reduces the amount of energy that we use, reduces the amount of oil. So I'm going to suggest 2 things at once. One thing is to take the tax incentives that we use for oil production, which is about $10 billion a year, and transfer that to something called maybe Carbimay, like a special bank that writes very low interest loans for the most efficient products, or for products that will save people significant amounts of energy. And that would be both things like washing machines or smart grid friendly appliances. It might be gas generators that you put in the home that throw power back up on the grid while heating your water, and it also would be things like cars. And in particular, this would give Detroit a signal that we're willing to really build markets for the most efficient cars, especially at a cheaper level than things like the Chevy Volt. Right now, what we do is we give big tax rebates to people who make over $100,000 a year, who can buy the Prius or who can buy the Chevy Volt or these things. Instead, what we need to do is focus on credit for the middle and the lower middle. And at the same time, we put a tax on gasoline of starting with 3 cents a year. We could call it something like the strong tax, which is like secure transportation and oil reduction, reducing oil needs, gas tax and label. And strong. I'm not sure I really have a future in politics, because I can't say that without a giggle. But anyway, but we need to do something like you start with a 3 cent a gallon gas tax the first year, and you ramp up every year, so that you're not just hitting people over the head with a giant tax and crippling the people in the lower middle class. You need to deliver this consistent signal, and at the same time, you put kind of a label on whenever you buy gas. You get a receipt that says, gas cost. Our oil dependence costs us a lot of money, and thanks for contributing to the gas tax. Now you're funding traffic jam reduction, which should save us 6.3 billion gallons of gasoline a year, or something like that. Anyway, you get a double kind of whammy with this whole thing. First of all, you could get, with refocusing the refocusing the money from tax breaks for oil, you could get $10 billion conservatively. You could turn that into $200 billion in loans that would get paid back. Secondly, because you do it at very low interest. Secondly, so that you would have that spending on the exact products that you wanted. Secondly, if you did this tax on gasoline, by 2020, you'd be getting about $55 billion a year on a 30-cent a gallon tax. If you managed to get $3 million in gasoline, 3 million gallons a day of gasoline reduction. So you'd get $55 billion a year from that tax, which you could then put into highways and whatever else you wanted to do, more efficient transportation. But you'd also get this savings of $125 to $140 billion a year in gasoline saving, money that people were not spending on gasoline, which would go back into the economy. Right now, we're spending $1.1 billion a day on gasoline. And a year ago, we were spending $860 million a year on gasoline. So there's this differential that we have no control over in the difference in price between $2.30 a gallon and $2.89 a gallon. We have no control over that. This is some way of getting control over it and also redirecting the spending back into the economy.
Okay, great, thank you. Megan.
I'll start out actually by outlining what I think are the main political barriers to getting this sort of thing done. Because I think the problem with a lot of these initiatives is that, like, we can all sit up here, we all live in cities, we drive little cars, and we can sit up and theorize about what would be a great way to get this stuff done, but then it runs up into the fact that Americans really love their cars, and anything that you try to do to get them out of their cars just like dies on the vine. And I think that cap and trade is a good example. I never thought it was very likely to pass because it is so, people are so committed to their energy lifestyle, and it isn't just that it's hard, because you can make changes. People did in the 70s. Low-income people made changes in the 70s. What it is they don't want to, and they think they shouldn't have to. And when you look at 70% of Americans don't believe in global warming right now, which is up like 30% from 2 years ago for reasons that are totally unclear to me, this is a really uphill battle. Taxing, we talked a lot yesterday about how spending cuts won't do it, and that's totally true, but tax increases on the rich aren't going to do it either. When you're looking at trying to close our budget gap, you're talking about like 90% effective tax rates. And I don't mean marginal tax rates. I mean trying to get 90% of their income away from them. Or 70%, or whatever the number of the day is. We're not going to get that kind of money, in part because when you manage to tax someone that highly, the money does go away. They move, they make changes in how they're consuming or how they're earning, which is why even like very progressive countries don't try to tax people on their income as much as on capital income as much as their labor income. We've got bipartisan agreement is really, really difficult. I think a lot of people up here are going to be in favor of tax simplification, but Reagan did this in an era when the Senate had a lot more comity and where people could actually sort of come together and help him with this priority. Every program is someone's income. We saw this during healthcare reform, right? All of this waste, fraud, and abuse, someone's living off that money. And boy, when you talk about touching it, they descend on Washington in a mob horde to threaten to kick you out. So far, we have been completely unable to cut healthcare costs. If you look at mammogram recommendations, as a woman with breast cancer in her family, when they said women shouldn't get mammograms at 40, I was like doing a little table dance, right? Like I was really excited. But people freaked out. Mammograms are really uncomfortable. It's not particularly good for you to shoot radiation through yourself if you can avoid it. But the mere fact that a government committee had recommended that women not do this brought up all of these fears about rationing and subpar health care, and it was undone almost immediately. And I think we're going to see that fight again and again. And the last thing is we're really not sure that the health care cuts that we promised in the bill we just passed are going to materialize. We've now had not just from the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, but also now the IMF saying, look guys, we're really not sure that these cuts to providers are actually going to be feasible. Not just politically feasible, that you may not be able to maintain the level of service delivery that you're envisioning if you do these cuts. So that said, what are the things that I think that we have to do and figure out a way to do against all of these barriers? I think tax simplification just has to be up there. When you look at all of the grotesque inefficiencies of our tax codes, it's completely ridiculous the amount of time people spend on it and money people spend on it, just beyond the complexity of the tax code that allows people to sort of shield their income from the government because there's so many little nooks and crannies. And we keep trying to fix these by closing the loopholes, but closing the loopholes often just opens another loophole. What you need is broad-based, very few deductions for anything, and then carbon taxes. I agree that they should happen both as a global warming priority and as something to help us close the gap. But I think initially, cap and trade, I think, is going to be problematic. I think initially they need to be fully rebated carbon taxes so that everyone, in fact, gets a check back for the full amount that the program collected at the end of the year in their taxes, prorated per person. It will not be perfect, but it will be a lot easier to sell. And later you can move that tax around, but I think initially you have to make Americans feel like they're not being penalized for doing something they feel they have a right to do. I think one of the things we should be looking at is less consumer first dollar coverage for healthcare. You know, when we talk about a lot of the big spending areas for healthcare, it's things like premature babies, cancer, cardiovascular treatment. I don't see any will to cut that stuff. I'm not even sure we should cut that stuff. They're phenomenally expensive, however. These are the things that reinsurers say are the biggest growth areas. But what we can cut, and what we actually are starting to see effectively with consumer-driven healthcare, is you can get people to be more thoughtful about their first dollar spending. You can get people to really think about whether they want an MRI. And focusing not to the point where people can't afford to do what they need to do, but making people more responsible for the choices about their healthcare. We have shown with things like the RAND study, you can do that without hurting outcomes. And you can be strategic about it. You can say, look, high blood pressure, we should just be doing that first dollar. But for other things, we're going to hold back and let people share more of the cost burden within their income, within what they can afford, rather than trying to give people this really, really comprehensive first dollar coverage. Because you do see big cost savings on both ends, from the consumer and for the healthcare program. I think a VAT is also probably inevitable, but what I worry about with the VAT is there's this timing problem. You want to enact it early so that you have the revenue if a crisis comes. But if you do that, there's a temptation to spend the money, right? There's a temptation to not make the choices that you need to build long-term fiscal sustainability. There's a temptation to do all sorts of new programs. And a lot of people this weekend have lots of new programs they'd love to do, all of which sound great. And the last thing I think is we need to think about means testing benefits. But I think this is going to be a lot more challenging than we often think, because if you think about what means testing means for Social Security and Medicare, it means penalizing people for saving. Right? The people who are going to have money are some of them going to be the people who are high income, but there's also going to be a big differential within income groups between the people who saved and the people who didn't. And that's not something that you want to do if you want to build a sort of fiscally sustainable society in the midst of this incredible demographic change that we're undergoing. So I think these are going to be just immensely challenging tasks, and I think that what I worry is that we really may need a pretty strong debt crisis where our interest rates start going up really fast in order to give politicians the courage that they need to make them.
Sasha.
So I'm going to have sort of the agree and sort of response, which is that, these are clearly needed, but I think the single most important thing we need to be doing right now is to really change the rhetoric, change the nature of the debate over a lot of these issues. And I view it as it is immoral and unethical to saddle those of us that is going to be alive in 2050 with intergenerational debt. It's egregious that we allow that to happen. And until we start talking about that as a moral and ethical issue, I think we're constantly going to be eating away at the edges of this problem. Now, when I look at other countries that have like sovereign wealth funds, to be a Norwegian, and they're building wealth for future generations, whereas we're talking about what's the proper level of debt to pass along to our kids and grandkids. So what I view is sort of, the incentives and investments that we're doing today are that most of them are there to enrich companies and individuals rather than the general public. And so when I think about what are the investments we should be making and how do we pay for them, and given that I can't say, well, we need to end the wars and we need to tax wealth and the rich, I look at sort of the 5 things that the Open Technology Initiative is right now focusing on, which are, in my mind, sort of the big question marks, but also potentials for today's technology. And they're going to be health IT and creating a lot of the systems and efficiencies that makes possible. intelligent transportation systems, which is this massive untapped potential for huge cost savings, life savings, saving lives, et cetera. I view open curriculum and pedagogy as critically important to this whole mess. Back in the day when I was doing project management for for-profit companies, we worked on, for McGraw-Hill, on a project to develop their curriculum. And the amount of money that went in versus was extracted from this ridiculous resource that they developed was insane. And the amount that we pay for books and educational supplies in this country is insane. And then finally, open, democratic, and neutral telecommunications networks. The amount that we subsidize these networks today, the amount that we pay out of our pockets every month for these systems versus what we should be paying or could be paying is really exceptional. And I think, when you add up all of that, you're talking about trillions of dollars savings over the next decade or two.
Okay, so let me open it up. Michael.
Yeah, a couple of points and a question for Maya. The first point is I'm a co-founder of New America and with Cheryl Schwinninger, co-director of the Economic Growth Program. In the view of the Economic Growth Program, we do not need to means test Social Security or Medicare. There's no Social Security crisis. If you lift the cap on the payroll tax, that will solve it for the rest of time. In terms of Medicare, as we've discussed, it's a healthcare problem, right? So if you have the healthcare prices in the U.S. Be what they are in the rest of the OECD, most of this deficit disappears. So let's just put on the table that there's not a consensus at this institution that we favor a means testing of Social Security and Medicare. In terms of the VAT, just a brief note, the Economic Growth Program with the Brookings Urban Tax Policy Center has recently commissioned a study about using a VAT to reduce corporate taxes and payroll taxes. You can access that on our site. Leo Hendry and I will have an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times on Monday morning arguing for a VAT in the U.S., if anyone's interested. So my question is for Maya. As you know, a decade ago, Ted Halstead and I shared the support for progressive consumption tax. The problem is, it's also known as a Calder tax after Nicholas Calder, British economist. Only 2 countries in history have ever adopted it, India and Sri Lanka in the late 1950s. It was such a complete disaster in terms of collection and popularity that they repealed it within 2 years. Since 1958, most countries in the world have adopted a VAT. Not a single nation in the last half century has adopted a progressive consumption tax. So my question is, doesn't that sort of affect the way we view a VAT as opposed to progressive consumption tax?
I think.
Go ahead, Maya.
So I think there's a really important discussion that's going to happen in the comparison. I usually think of it as the Bradford X tax, but between the Bradford X tax and a VAT, and the pros and cons in both. And so clearly the advantage of something like a progressive consumption tax is that you can meet the same kind of distributional effects that we have in the current income tax. You can make the tax code more progressive if you think that you should because of growing income inequality, or less, I suppose, if you think that you shouldn't. A VAT is more limited in its ability to meet the kind of distributional effects that we have now. You can take out sort of one big deduction, one big rebate across the board. You can, but you shouldn't exempt certain things. Once you get into like exempting medicine and children's clothes, you just see a huge god-awful lobbying industry sprouting up on all the things that should be exempted from the VAT. So that's not the way you want to do it. You can, on the other hand, use a VAT as a partial part of tax reform and make the rest of the tax code more progressive. So that's another alternative. I think the fact that the progressive consumption tax hasn't been implemented before doesn't mean that it couldn't be right now. One of the hardest things is that you have to track everything you do for the income tax and also how much you save. I mean, I'm not going to go into the long details of how it works, but as long as you're tracking what you're saving, then it's pretty easy to do. That's something we now have to do because you have to have your financial records. So because these things, because of technology, are out there, it's now much easier to do than it was 50 years ago. In the end, I don't think it's a big distinction. I think one is harder to implement, a progressive consumption tax, and one has better distributional effects. And in the end, as everyone here I think has said, all of this stuff is so hard to do. I think it's really important to notice that we frame this discussion as how do we raise money to pay for new things? But the discussion really is also going to have to be how do we raise money to deal with the things that we've already borrowed for. And it becomes so much harder to do something if you're not linking it to the great new thing you're doing, that I'll take whatever we can do. I'll take whichever tax. Basically, in my mind, I sort of said the tax reforms that I like in the order that I like them. Energy tax expenditures first, energy second, consumption third. But whatever you can get the political will to muster is the best starting point we can find, because I think the system's so broken, it's going to be very hard to do any of this.
Amy?
My question was going to be for Lisa. I agree with a lot of your recommendations. Amy Christensen, sorry, I'm in the Energy Advisory Board. I agree with a lot of your recommendations, but I was going to ask you about the price on carbon, and then Megan dove in, so I just have to respond to a couple things before I get back to that question for you, Lisa, which is one, why have things changed on the perception of the science? They're spending hundreds of millions of dollars, the oil and coal industries, to do that, and we don't have the other side pushing back because we're just not putting our money there. Second, on the cost issue of that price on carbon and its impacts on low income, middle income, we've done the weatherization program, and it's reduced energy costs by an average of 25% per household, and the carbon price we're talking about is far less than that. And so the benefits of increasing energy efficiency by putting that price on carbon will swamp the per unit price increase of energy. At least that's what the Peterson Institute analysis that just came out in the last couple of days of Kerry Lieberman has shown us. And in addition, it will create 200,000 jobs a year, the Kerry Lieberman bill, as currently structured according to that analysis. Finally, it will reduce U.S. oil imports by 1/3, which I know is also in Lisa's interest. So, Lisa, I'd love your comments, though, on that price on carbon, please.
I think a price on carbon is a good idea. I think the more transparent it can be, so that the further the idea... I think that the financial crisis created a huge swirl of suspicion and distrust, and that has really, I think, leached over into the politics of doing a climate change bill, because the bills are so complicated. People feel that they don't know what they are, and there's a panic. There's two things going. One thing is a panic about, like, what are we creating? And we trusted these people to run the loan industry, and now what happened? And I think that things like the Cantwell-Collins Act are very interesting because they're quite short. They are a direct repayment of the cost. But what you need to do within Kerry Lieberman or Waxman-Markey is somehow make the whole thing very transparent. And I think at the moment it's not particularly transparent to people. So that's one thing. And I think the other aspect of climate change that hasn't gotten enough of climate change legislation is that while the cost averaged over the entire country per person is going to be relatively modest, and as you say, the Peterson Institute says that you'll be getting back more than you've paid in. In fact, certain parts of the country are really going to suffer, and certain parts of the economic spectrum are really going to suffer. And I would say that 25th percentile with the $50,000 income that doesn't have access to get a new car is going to suffer. And I would say somebody in Ohio that's 86% dependent upon coal for electricity is going to suffer differentially compared to someone in California where 1%. So what you need to do, this is not saying this stuff won't work, it's just saying you need to think about what we've been thinking about is that we insulate the lowest 20% in the carbon bills. And we put a lot of the allowances get directed towards the top 20%. Waxman-Markey had, I think, 60% or 70% of the benefit of the allowances was landing on the top 20% through their stock returns. So what we need to do is start focusing on these other lower two quintiles. I mean, we really need to think in policy terms right there. And how are we going to do that? How are we going to get something? How are we going to decarbonize the infrastructure of Ohio, for example? How are we going to make this more palatable? Because it's not just politics. It's actually people saying, I'm caught. And since I have the floor, I just wanted to say, I think that we tend to, when we think about people at the $50,000 income level, we think about them in their cars. We have an old model from the 70s of them driving sort of like a muscle car, of it being this whole, kind of Bruce Springsteen song about the car. Actually, I think that a lot of families now, the car has become a burden. The car is kind of a monster that eats money, and it eats repairs, and it eats, some people in that income category are paying 28% interest on their auto loan for a car that's crap. And, it is grinding, and people don't like sitting in traffic, and they don't like the whole thing. I think a lot of the meaning of the car has changed. and particularly with high fuel prices, it's become more of a burden, and so is traffic, and people want to get out of traffic. So it's not to say that they don't love their car, it's just that their feelings about their car, it's different.
Okay, why don't we go to so I like Bruce Springsteen for the record, but we won't bring him back.
I
We're going to
do
go to
too.
lightning round and do 3 quick questions. Cheryl, 2 over from Cheryl, and then over here from Michael. I'm going to collect all of them, and then we'll do them real quick. So, Michael, you got the microphone first, so go ahead.
I have the mic, so I'll go. So following up on this, if the carbon trading is still, if we consider it politically still on the table, I'm wondering if we can't just push it further. So I'm wondering if what you would think about revisiting the Sky Trust concept, which would work similar to the Alaska Permanent Fund, where instead of giving away these carbon trading credits, we actually phase in a substantial charge for them, pool that money, say use half of it toward deficit reduction, and the other half maybe to compensate the folks who are getting hit the hardest with an increase in the cost of carbon, whether it's geographic or by income. And I'm just more sanguine about that than I am on a direct gas tax, which I think is a non-starter politically.
Okay. Cheryl.
This is a question for Sasha. Cheryl Swinninger, Director of the Economic Growth Program. Sasha, on the intergenerational equity question, I understand you don't want to saddle future generations with debt. Do you also oppose the transfer of net wealth to other generations? Because, in fact, what will happen is, even with the increase in debt, net wealth has increased dramatically in this country, and you're going to have the largest transfer of wealth from the baby boom generation to a much smaller generation. Now, much of that is in private hands, but nonetheless, the net gains to the subsequent generation is the largest in American history.
Okay. One last one. Right. 2 over.
Bill Hartung. I was glad Maya mentioned defense reform as a source of savings, but I think there's sort of 3 levels. One is try to make procurement more efficient. One is you get rid of obviously unnecessary weapons. But to really make big savings, you would have to change your idea of what the military is for, what are the missions. In the discussion of fiscal discipline, do you think it could help jumpstart that conversation, or are they going to sort of proceed on parallel, separate tracks?
Okay, so we have 3 questions: paying for carbon credits and use it for allocating some of the benefits, whether Sasha's going to give up his inheritance, and then the other opportunities for defense reform. So, Sasha, since you got a direct question, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, absolutely. So let me start by saying I'm absolutely for supporting the taxation of wealth, and I think that it's a very good thing that we don't allow wealth to further accrue indefinitely into the hands of a smaller and smaller plutocracy. I think I can be against the bad thing without being against the good thing. And I view, like passing on inheritance is a pretty good thing, and passing along debt is not so good. I'll end by just saying, what's really killing us are all these externalities. We come up with these models for the smart investment, and then we get hit with war casualties, or we get hit with pollution, or we get hit with all the time that we spend stuck in traffic on the Beltway. And that's not accounted for in our economic models. And we're paying for that. It might not be immediately visible, but in the end, we do end up paying for that.
Okay, great. Who wants to handle the carbon?
I have to say that at this point, I don't think that it's on the table. And most of the political journalists I know don't think that cap and trade is on the table. Maybe it will be in a couple of years again. But it's really, really difficult. It's probably the most difficult legislation we've tried, and I include healthcare. It's probably the most difficult legislation we've tried to pass in the last couple decades. So, that's a sort of dour and unhappy thing to say. I'm very much in favor of some, cap and trade. I prefer less to taxes, but I just think that it's proven politically because, when you say like we're going to get rid of coal, the West Virginia guys descend on DC en masse. It's always that like, yes, you can in a perfect world imagine a very efficient system, but there is always a very large vested interest, and because they're so geographically concentrated, it's very hard to overcome them. So things like auctioning permits, which I'm 100% in favor of, they died because people from West Virginia and so forth came in and said, like, this is dead in the water if you do this. And those kinds of trade-offs have to be made. And the bill still doesn't look like it's really close to passing. So
I have to say, I think there's a huge opportunity cost to this delay.
I completely agree with that.
So any way that we can slice up the baby and get some of it through would be acceptable. So if we can, a recent poll came out saying that for some reason having to do with lots of money being spent, now only I think 50% of Americans support doing something about carbon, whereas 74% support doing something about energy. So what we should do is do something about energy and then go and deal with the carbon as soon as we can.
Okay. Maya, you closing thoughts
Yes,
on the
okay.
defense
So
question?
I think that all sorts of carbon taxes were sort of seen as the third rail, and that's true of something like Social Security as well, until you start comparing it to all the other options. And I think taxing carbon is going to come back and be quite popular quite quickly. And I think that the idea that you're talking about, it's sort of phasing it in and using some of the money to help make people whole for what they're going through, and then some of it for deficit reduction is going to work really well. On defense, I think that the biggest areas are procurement, weapons. I'd also add defense healthcare. That's the biggest cost. I think those things will be looked at from a budgetary perspective, but I think rethinking the whole role of defense in our economy and our country is going to have to come from outside experts. But I think that's a discussion that's starting. I'm hearing it happening much more than I ever did. Just a final quick story about intergenerational equity. About 10 years ago, I was, without understanding it, I thought I was doing a TV interview, but really I was being dial tested. And somebody rudely sent me a photo with all these lines plummeting, saying, we have tested you and found out that you are thoroughly unlikable, and that one of the main problems is that if you talk about cutting Social Security benefits and raising retirement age and use terms like actuarial balance, people really don't like you. So here we have figured out how to fix it. You need to, whenever you talk about this, talk about intergenerational fairness and hold up photos of your kids. And I said, that's great, I don't have kids. And they said, it doesn't matter, you need pictures of fake kids to hold up whenever you give a talk. So I now have kids, and I promise I will never hold up the pictures of them in a talk about this, but I do think that the whole intergenerational element is clearly, the dial testers think, one of the more compelling ways to discuss the issue.
All right.
Well, with that, please thank the panel and ask Maya to see the pictures of the kids.
Thanks, Lenny.